Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Lavey, the Research Events Officer at Swinburne Research. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Socio-Technical Approach to Public Interest Technology, which is basically a co-production between Swinburne and La Trobe University. So you'll shortly hear from Professor Laurie Zion, who is the Associate Dean Research and Industry Engagement for the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at La Trobe University. Associate Professor Dhyan Sivasubramaniam, who is the Program Leader for Public Interest Technology through the Social Innovation Research Institute at Swinburne, and Co-Program Leader, Associate Professor Sam Wilson, who is also from the Social Innovation Research Institute at Swinburne. We're also pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Roba Abbas, who is a Senior Lecturer, Operations and Systems and Academic Program Director with the Faculty of Business and Law at the University of Wollongong. Before we start with today's proceedings, though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I acknowledge that we are hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. Just some very basic housekeeping. You probably all know the score, so any questions, just pop that in the Q&A box. If you've got any comments, feel free to pop those in the comments box, but we'll focus on the Q&A box for questions. And also, if you have any concerns, if you've raised your hand and you do end up speaking in the recording and have any concerns about being in that recording, just email me at the address here, and I can edit that out at the in the recording. And so at this point, I will hand over to Sam with today's presentation. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. So hi, everyone. My name is Sam Wilson, and I'm an Associate Professor of Leadership in the Swinburne Business School, as well as the roles that Paul mentioned earlier with the Social Innovation Research Institute. So before we start today, I'd like to provide some general context about the forum and this webinar series, which is devoted to the topic of public interest technology. So as many or maybe most of you appreciate, public interest technologies put people and society at the center of our choices and strive to ensure that the benefits of our technologies are widely shared, as widely as possible. However, it's really important to note that public interest technology isn't just one thing. Moreover, it's not just about people who are experts in technology. Rather, it includes all of those who are responsible for adopting and implementing technologies, particularly those that are implemented in the public sphere. The Technology by Society Forum provides a space for engagement between STEM and HASS academics, with an interest in the design, development, and application of public interest technologies. The goal of each forum is to generate opportunities for research, thought leadership, and social innovation by researchers at Swinburne and La Trobe and our partners. It's my pleasure now to pass on to Associate Professor Dhyan Sivasubramaniam, who will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Roba Abbas.
Thank you, Sam. And hello, everyone. So my name is Dhyan Sivasubramaniam. I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Swinburne University. As Sam mentioned, this webinar is part of our Technology by Society Forum. This is the third event of the Technology by Society Forum, and the forum is co-convened by Professor Laurie Zion from La Trobe University, myself, and Associate Professor Sam Wilson. And in today's event, we're very fortunate to be hearing from Dr. Roba Abbas. Roba Abbas is a Senior Lecturer in Operations and Systems, and she's also Academic Program Director with the Faculty of Business and Law at the University of Wollongong in Australia. She is a visiting professor with the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University in the US. She is a co-editor of the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society and former associate editor of the IEEE Technology and Society magazine. Roba has a PhD in location-based services regulation and industry experience in web design and development. She primarily researches methodological approaches to complex socio-technical systems design, emphasising transdisciplinarity, co-design, and the intersection of society, technology, ethics, and regulation. And in today's webinar, Roba will provide us with an introduction to socio-technical theory and how it's applied to public interest technology. So our webinar will begin today with a presentation by Roba for about 20 minutes. And after her presentation, Roba will have a conversation with Laurie Zion, where Roba and Laurie will delve a little further into the nature of the socio-technical framework and how it can help us to develop public interest technology. And then for the final 10 to 15 minutes of our webinar today, we'll open this up to questions from the audience. So as questions occur to you throughout today's webinar, we invite you to put your questions in the Q&A box, as Paul mentioned earlier, and we'll take your questions from there. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to hand you over to Dr. Roba Abbas.
Thank you so much, Diane. Just quickly share screen. How's that? Is that okay?
Yep, that's coming through perfectly.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Thank you so very much for that kind introduction, Diane, and thank you for the invitation, Sam, Diane, and Laurie, and to Paul as well in the background, who's been helping us out. It's a pleasure to be here today at the Technology by Society Forum and to be delivering an introduction to the socio-technical approach to public interest technology. I am joining today from Wollongong, Australia, and as such, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of Dharawal country and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Before I begin my talk, I would also like to recognise my long-term collaborators, Professor Katina Michael from Arizona State University, Professor Jeremy Pitt from Imperial College London, and Associate Professor Rob Nichols from the University of New South Wales. This presentation will draw on some of our work over the years, in addition to recent work that's been published as part of 3 special issues, editorials, in fact, on socio-technical co-design and public interest technology. And these editorials more specifically were in collaboration with an international team in Katina Michael, Jeremy Pitt, Jason Sargent, Eusebio Skornavaca, Jumana Abu-Ghazali, Salah Hamdoun, and Netra and Nalini Chetri. And I'd also like to thank Matt Mitka for his contribution to some of the work that we've been engaged in as part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science work into public interest technology. The intention of this short presentation is really to provide an introduction to the socio-technical approach to research in view of its origins, foundational concepts, and also principles. So I'll be covering briefly the design aspect, which is central to the socio-technical approach, in addition to the link to a public interest technology framework, followed by an overview of our future research trajectory. Despite the emphasis on the socio-technical approach as being the main intention here, I see this presentation and body of work as contributing to much more, to a broader discussion about how we see our world in view of our relationship with technology, predominantly, a world in which we are observing both disruptive and incremental innovations and technologies and complex socio-technical systems and structures that have the potential to fundamentally alter the way in which we interact with the world around us. As such, there are many tensions whereby we're required to think really carefully about how we design and develop technology in the public interest, and how we can also simultaneously exploit technological and scientific advancements whilst also thinking about the socio-ethical challenges that inevitably emerge as a result. So as part of this broader discussion, perhaps we might question and be fascinated by technological progression and developments as we think about future modes of operation represented by the image on your screen. Simultaneously, we may still be trying to understand present modes of operation and present technologies that we're interacting with and the related socio-ethical and other implications. As we consider both present and future modes of operation, perhaps we are thinking about how we explore and interact with individual devices or individually with devices, or how we investigate future of work scenarios. And while we're thinking about the future from an organizational perspective, perhaps we may also or even extend our attention to envisaging our future. So futures that are about technological potential as per the image I presented earlier, but also those that exist at the other end of the spectrum. So those that point to the undesirable futures in terms of how we may preemptively attempt to avoid such future scenarios. And with that backdrop, we return essentially to our perceptions and our view of the world, of our socio-technical context, in order to gain a better understanding of how our interactions with technology, and more specifically, a better understanding of our interactions with technology, and more specifically, how we may go about designing or redesigning systems with, as opposed to for people and in the public interest. So the question that I'm posing here to you all is, how do we navigate this socio-technical landscape? It's a very complex socio-technical landscape. And one way to do so is through the socio-technical approach. If we look to existing scholarship around socio-technical theory and the socio-technical approach, it's quite difficult to encapsulate all of those learnings and lessons and literature in a 20-minute presentation, but I'll do my best to point to what the socio-technical approach can refer to, which is essentially summarized on your screen. So we can think of socio-technical as referring to a concept, essentially denoting an entity that is made up of both social and human elements. We can think of it as a theory, so built on a set of key assumptions and principles about what constitutes a socio-technical system, the meaning of subsystems, dimensions, and so on. We can also think about it as that third point, as a set of principles for interacting with different types of systems, for instance, designing or redesigning work systems within an organizational setting. Next, the socio-technical approach could also signify a phased approach to systems design and development. So this could involve the technical fields, such as computer science and systems engineering-based processes, for example, in addition to other disciplines. And there are a range of other references to socio-technical in the literature if you were to look closely there. In this presentation, however, I'm referring predominantly to socio-technical as a theory. So socio-technical theory is not a new concept. It essentially emerged as an organizational theory in the 1950s at the Tavistock Institute in London as a means of thinking about and understanding work systems in the context initially of coal mining, and was then extended beyond this application area to the present day use of the theory. And specifically at that time, the purpose was to think about work systems design, redesign, and interventions in terms of the interrelationships between the social and the technical components within that particular work system or a given work system. And it has since morphed, particularly in its application around a range of disciplines and contexts, such as the information systems discipline, which is largely the disciplinary lens that I'm applying here. But our work has also progressed beyond consideration of the information systems discipline to encompass other disciplines. Something that I'd like to note here is that at the time of its introduction, socio-technical theory essentially challenged the dominant technological paradigm or technology-based paradigm of the time, and it presented a new way of thinking, and that's essentially what's on your screen. So the old paradigm was about the technological imperative, about technological determinism. This new, at the time, socio-technical paradigm or model was about joint optimization. So how we move away from that technological imperative to think about the social. As part of this process, instead of thinking about man as an extension of the machine, it's man as complementary to the machine. Instead of as humans as being an expendable spare part, it's about them being a resource to be developed. And there are a range of other points that we can compare between the old paradigm and new paradigm, things around innovation, ideas around commitment, and importantly, collaboration, which I'll pick up on in a moment. In the interest of time, I will focus on a few main points. So the socio-technical approach is built on the foundation of many concepts and several foundational principles, of which I'll review 3 as part of this presentation and very briefly. And I think these 3 will provide us with sufficient detail for the remainder of our discussion today. The specific concepts that I'm referring to are the open systems basis, which defines systems, behaviors, and states. The second is about the notion of subsystems, namely 3 interacting dimensions, which I'll get to in a moment. And the third is about the core principles, which essentially, if we were to divide them into 2 areas, it's around the way that the system components interact and also the idea of optimization. So let's look at each of these in a bit more detail. The first is that the socio-technical approach is built on general systems theory and open systems theory. And I've included a seminal study here for your reference. This systems or systems thinking foundation is important from the perspective of inheriting key assumptions about the behaviors and the nature of system components. And this is really important. The idea of the systems goal, for example, and how we define inputs, processes, and outputs within a context, such as the environmental context. So if I were to put it simply, it allows us to think about systems design and engineering efforts as being embedded within an evolving and complex environment and provides a necessary framing around systems complexity and conceptualization, which we'll talk about both of these elements as we go through this discussion. The other 2 concepts I'd like to highlight are the ideas of a subsystem and the second idea of principles. So subsystems essentially point to the social, technical, and environmental subsystems, which in themselves comprise of other elements or interacting classes of variables. In terms of principles, this really talks to the notion of interactions between the systems components as being determinants of their success, specifically between those subsystems, so how the social, technical, and environmental elements interact as pointing to system success. And there's also this idea of a core principle, which is joint optimization, which is typically defined as the attainment through some kind of socio-technical design of essentially a best fit or a match between system components through evolving and iterative socio-technical design processes that advocate for engagement. So on the current slide, you may have seen this before if you've read into the socio-technical domain. It's quite a prominent representation of socio-technical systems or a-socio-technical systems, where you can see the social system, the technical system, and interacting variable classes within a particular context. And this is in the context of a management information system. There are other representations since this original work, and I'll present one in our emergent framework in a moment. But prior to doing so, we're still talking at the theoretical level here, and we need some kind of means in which we can move from theoretical underpinnings of socio-technical theory through to the required methods and operationalization of the principles within the theory. And in summary, these are the major developments that you can see on your slide that allow us to progress from theory to method to operationalization in practice. So the socio-technical systems basis, the general systems basis and open systems basis is our starting point. And this is followed by a derivative of or application of the open systems paradigm through the socio-technical theory or approach. And then we can move on to application. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm primarily approaching this through an information systems perspective in the field of human-computer interaction. So that's our next progression, and acknowledging that body of work. And that brings us to the idea of participation and co-design as being central to the achievement of the principles of socio-technical theory, specifically, as I mentioned earlier, the attainment of optimization or joint optimization, which is a concept that our team is revisiting at present in the context of current socio-technical systems. While participation and co-design are certainly popular topics and approaches at present, seminal socio-technical work flag the importance of intense collaboration through applied research projects. And we can note the emphasis here on the involvement of multiple disciplines, the focus on relationships, and the time involved in engaging individuals and people in such projects. And we seemingly are having the same discussions presently. Here's another early example advocating for human-centeredness, for cooperation, and for human requirements early on or as a precursor of any socio-technical analysis, as opposed to, again, focusing primarily on the technical aspects, or firstly on the technical aspects. The importance of planning and aligning these plans to human requirements is also a key point here. And yet another example from that same text that emphasizes social responsibility, decision-making, and ensuring systems are rewarding and fulfilling at the conclusion of any design effort. The call for cooperation, participation, and co-design as a means of operationalizing socio-technical theory has in a way been answered in a range of different ways through socio-technical studies, such as through decision-based decision-making processes or design-based processes, dominant ones of which are presented on your screen. And our team has been working for over 15 years now on attempting to extend some of these models and applying them to present day contexts. And here's a representative example of our work in a model for applying socio-technical co-design in the context of engineering-based methodologies in the design and development of robotic capsules for endoscopy purposes more specifically. And we're presently working on additional applications of these theories and methodologies, but I'll briefly illustrate the link before I wrap up between this socio-technical approach and public interest technology for the purposes of this forum. So what does all of this mean in terms of our discussion on public interest technology, on all the things that Sam and Diane spoke about earlier? When we apply the socio-technical approach to public interest technology, I think a foundational idea is that this requires careful planning and the conceptualization of a given socio-technical system or ecosystem in a way that points to some of these theoretical concepts that we spoke about and also appreciates the importance of stakeholder engagement and inclusion. I will identify 3 important points here in the application of the socio-technical approach to public interest technology, each of which have been highlighted in our recent special issue editorials that will be shown on screen. So the first is that of socio-technical co-design, which advocates for the engagement of diverse stakeholders and disciplines, both technical and non-technical in nature. The second pertains to how we perceive innovation and technology design and development. And that essentially requires a paradigm shift, yet again, from the techno-economic models that are dominant to models that promote social development and purpose-driven socio-technical innovation. And the third is a public interest technology framework. So there is a requirement for an emergent framework that is socio-technical in nature, specific to public interest technology, and one that allows us to conceptualize public interest technology as an open socio-technical ecosystem. And this is the proposed public interest technology framework that provides a high-level view of the elements, the dimensions, the subsystems, and the flows within a complex socio-technical ecosystem, with the intention of enhancing our understanding of the elements, the distinct elements within the ecosystem, but also their relationships to one another. The purpose of this is there are many purposes, but one purpose is to inform operationalization through co-design, participation, and other human-centered approaches oriented really toward empowerment, human health and well-being, and also environmental sustainability, which we've explored in other work sort of peripheral to this. We recently presented this end-to-end framework as part of an American Association for the Advancement of Science scientific panel session. In the interest of time here, I cannot go into too much detail, but please reach out if you're interested in finding out more about that. But a dominant idea here is that the socio-technical approach provides us with a mechanism through which we can engage stakeholders in a manner that is human-centered, in a manner that's inclusive, that focuses on empowerment, but that also recognizes the role of technology and technological progression. And with that, and in closing, I think I'm spot on time here. Our team is working on the extension of this framework, if we're to look at future research direction, and its application across a range of settings. Importantly, we are asking many questions. So some examples are how the goal of the systems and frameworks should be defined, how we can enhance existing methodologies for engagement. That will be another area of interest, and further exploring each element within that particular framework. Importantly, we're trying to build on this work to gain a better understanding of how we consider design and development of technology in the public interest. And we're doing so within a complex and evolving socio-technical ecosystem, and that is
Robo might have temporarily frozen, or I've temporarily frozen. I'm not sure if people can hear me, but I don't know how we can unfreeze Robo either. But Robo, thanks so much for a really fantastic presentation. And I think you're back with us now. You temporarily froze. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you very well. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's great. My name's Laurie Zion. I'm going to be having a discussion now with Robo, but during that discussion, as indicated before, if you want to ask questions, just go into that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in any questions or comments there. And we'll pick some of these up as we go. But Robo, just to start, I guess that the trajectory that you've outlined seems to be getting researchers and industry from the point where the focus has been very much on the technology and the end user to the systems of innovation or more socio-technology approaches, that take account of, as you mentioned, the broader range of stakeholders and underlying drivers such as the need to nurture or maintain democracy. How far down that track are we now?
That's an excellent question with many parts to it, Laurie. I'll probably divide it into two just to manage it now in terms of thinking about challenges. And I think you mentioned how far down the track, so progress within this realm. First, let's tackle the challenges bit. So in our observations, I think the challenges tend to be around a range of things. I'll look at it mainly from an industry perspective, then a research perspective, and then maybe we can talk about the human-centered element. I think from an industry perspective, demonstrating the value of socio-technical approaches as being opportunities for change and for positive social and technological outcomes as opposed to a hindrance to existing design and development approaches is one of the primary challenges. So existing systems design and development projects tend to be more technology focused, as you suggested, about the end user, and which is great that there are some user-centered studies, for example, but I think we need to progress beyond that. And as I said in my presentation, while the technological focus is important from the perspective of capitalizing on technological progression and thinking about industry technology advancements, for example, we cannot forget the social aspects. So I'd probably point to that. So the socio-technical approach as being an opportunity for change rather than a hindrance, as being a challenge from an industry-based perspective. In terms of researchers, while there is, or research in general, while there is progress, I would point probably to existing structures in academia around discipline-based faculties in schools, and the way that these are structured in a way that it's risky to move between disciplinary silos to incorporate a range of different perspectives. So we have, for example, structures around career progression frameworks and so on in academia, and we tend to stick to our disciplinary silos. So a challenge is how we move beyond those. And while there are schemes, for instance, available, we certainly have some of these in our Global Challenges scheme at the University of Wollongong that encourage multidisciplinary work. I think there's more opportunity to do more from that regard. So I'm not sure whether from a research perspective, it's about the tension between user-centered design and socio-technical design as being two distinct aspects, or if it's more so the structures that exist that are not conducive, I guess, to multidisciplinary work and to more socio-technical approaches. Now, to bring maybe those two aspects together across both academia and industry, user-centered design cannot be perceived as the same as co-design. They're two very distinct things, the latter of which requires additional time, additional resources, and engagement of a broader set of stakeholders, which is why it's challenging to, I guess, promote that kind of approach as being the preferred approach, because we are time poor, we are resource poor, and engagement is quite difficult to achieve in the proper sense of the term in the ideal of co-design. I think there was a second part to your question, is about progress, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, just where we're up to, and have developments or events like COVID had any role in potentially accelerating some of the conversations that are needed to underpin this general trend?
Oh, great questions. So in terms of how far along are we, I think it's it's difficult to evaluate given that a lot of this is context specific. So depending on what projects you're working on. So I can point to several projects I'm working on, each of which apply these approaches in a very different way and have their own trajectory, their own constraints, their own limitations, and we can draw out some insights from that. But what our team have observed over the past few years, and maybe this is due to COVID, maybe it's just the nature of the setting, the research in this space, is that there has been a resurgence in socio-technical research, which we're delighted about. COVID has in some way, I'm not sure whether it's accelerated the socio-technical approaches or the need for socio-technical approaches as such, but it has certainly highlighted, if we to draw on examples such as the COVID Safe app, for example, and the rollout in Australia, it's certainly highlighted the need for socio-technical framings to avoid certain implementations or the impacts of certain implementations. So I'm not sure whether it's encouraged additional thought around methodologies as such, if that's a COVID specific thing, but it has certainly provided us with practical examples of why we actually need public interest technology, socio-technical approaches, a more balanced, I guess, perspective around the design and development of these systems.
Yeah. How's the framework being used in specific disciplinary cases, such as bringing together social scientists and engineers?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's, again, context specific, been used in many different ways. Some sort of concrete examples of how we've used the framework is first to articulate the system of interest and the opportunities for high-level mapping of the socio-technical system. That provides us with, I guess, a solid foundation to enable agreement between, you mentioned, social scientists and engineers around a common goal for the system. And that's a fabulous starting point because there's usually sort of discrepancies in goals. We usually have our different trajectories, our different paths that we're on based on our disciplinary areas. And it's also provided an opportunity to think about a common understanding or a shared understanding about how to approach technology, design and development efforts. So that's sort of first point. And another thing that I think is quite useful in terms of this framework is it's given us an opportunity to gain a shared understanding of context. So the environmental context, the open nature of the system, the complex, tightly coupled, really dynamic nature of the system, the importance and value of considering the regulatory and other environments and contexts that will inevitably influence how we conceptualize the framework and how we define the system together. One thing that I think is really important about this, while it is quite an abstract level framework, I think it's helpful from the perspective in that it allows you to isolate. So this is one application area, isolate the area or the areas of the socio-technical systems that are candidates really for design or redesign centered around human values and requirements. And that's where that common or shared understanding comes from. But I think while I can draw on many more examples, one thing I would like to note, Laura, is that the intention is not just to focus here on common understandings between social scientists and engineers and have a boundary there. It's about a broader philosophy also, in addition to that, of stakeholder engagement, where we think outside the academic institution setting, where we seek industry and public engagement, and we co-design around a shared vision for that socio-technical system across industry, academia, government, and so on.
So who are the people that who do tend to participate in formulating and communicating that shared vision? I'm familiar with, in the case of journalism, public interest journalism has been a concept that's bandied around for decades. It's come up again recently in Australia because of the strains that that media has been placed under over the last decade or so. But I guess there've also been a lot of debates about, what's meant by public interest journalism. And you could perhaps look at that kind of discussion as just one example, I guess, of what might happen in the broader context of bringing people from industry, the public, volunteers, all the kind of stakeholders, and brokering some sort of shared understanding or agreement. And what do those processes look like at the moment?
Sure.
What does participation mean in this? Yeah.
Sure, not a problem. So participation can take on many different forms from a socio-technical perspective, at least. So concepts of participation, of co-design and so on. They're quite interesting, Laura, but they're not consistently defined. So it's a very good question that you ask. So in the past, we've had to draw on seminal studies and extend those to consider what participation looks like across each of those stakeholder groups and how we define input. So you've got your stakeholder types or categories. You've then got input ranging, for instance, from observation right through to the ideal of co-design. So in some cases, we might not actually embark on a socio-technical co-design effort. We could potentially just think about things in terms of observation-based processes or user-centered processes as the need sort of calls for it. So that's one aspect to the whole participation discussion, the degrees of input. We then have additional considerations regarding participation that you rightly pointed out. So stakeholder engagement, industry versus academia versus government and the public and so on. So how do we know who to choose? How do we know the methods of engagement? How can we translate then those, I guess, what insights we derive from these participatory processes into practical outcomes? And importantly, how then do we revisit and employ iterative processes to confirm what we found and whether it's aligned to our original vision? Then there's thinking about how we revert to that initial goal of the socio-technical system and how we design a suitable system with people that promote social transformation and so on, as opposed to conforming to old paradigms. Back to your question of how those processes look like, they can come in many different forms. So I showed some examples, in the interest of time, glossed over them as a series of phases. There are other examples that are more principles-based approaches, others that focus, for instance, on design through compassionate approaches and so on. What we've tried to do with this framework is sit up at a broader level to define what the system looks like, and then depending on the stakeholders that are required in a particular process, the method of engagement that we select, the degrees of input, you have a series of configurations that are then specific to a particular context. So while we can generalize to some degree about elements within a system, each context requires its own configuration around those elements that I spoke about.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming in now, and Matt, I'm going to read your question out because it links to this discussion. I see this, says Matt, being able to be resourced with larger enterprises or public sector bodies, but what are less resource intensive approaches to this type of co-design for bootstrap tech startups? Do you have any examples in this context? Great question, Matt.
It's an excellent question, Matt. Thank you so much. And Matt Mitka is a leading co-design expert in this space, and through his work with Tethics, and he's trying to do a lot of these, operationalize a lot of these socio-technical approaches and co-design approaches in practice. You're quite right, and this is part of that broader challenge, Matt, of funding around these particular projects. So we're met with the challenges of how we fund multidisciplinary research. We're also thinking about smaller organizations not having enough resources, time, effort, and energy to do these, I guess, practices. But I can draw on some examples that we've used that haven't had a great deal of resources. So for example, in the app development space, where we focused on specific co-design workshops. But I do agree with you that this approach requires a lot more funding on the part of the government in terms of funding startups. But I think prior to doing so, we need to demonstrate the value of this approach before the funding comes in. But I see that as one of the major challenges. We have been able to get so far with minimal funding in a range of different project contexts. So one example is working on just that shared understanding element rather than focusing on the development of blueprints or full-blown processes. So that's a great starting point, and we've been able to demonstrate from that particular example that there is a requirement for these kind of processes to then allow us to, I guess, gain access to the resources that we need to further these processes. But I'm in complete agreement with you that larger organizations have the capacity to do this, but I think with these processes as well, they're better suited to the smaller teams, the smaller communities, things such as what you're doing with your pilot studies, Matt, and so on, and other work that we've done around specific instances or individual instances of use rather than society level systems that require more, I guess, resources and time.
Great. Thanks for that. I've got a question about the utility of the term public interest technology. We've certainly seen, growth in activity across both academia and industry in the States, and it's starting here in Australia as well. Do you feel it's a good form of shorthand for conveying the sort of processes and outcomes that you've been examining in your work? Does it connect up? Is it sticky enough? Do enough people latch onto it in a way that can connect people, especially in smaller enterprises, smaller universities?
Sorry, Laurie, can you please clarify by the latter part of your question?
Is the concept of public interest tech, is it sticky enough? Like, is it something that when people hear it, they get a general sense of what it means and that they can become associated with it? Is it a good way of framing in shorthand the kind of processes that you've been talking about today?
Sure. Thank you, Laurie. I think in a way it is. I think when you combine the socio-technical approach to public interest technology, there's more of a connection as to a defined methodology, a defined process. As I said, the socio-technical area has been around, at least in the information systems and organizational theory space, since the 1950s. So that's something that's tried, that's tested, that's established. You're quite right that it's gaining traction here, but something that I think would be helpful in terms of making the term more sticky or using it, I don't know whether using it as a shorthand is the approach that we should be following, but to make it certainly more visible is to think about it in a number of different ways. So thinking about public interest technology, for example, as a philosophy, and that's a philosophy of design, of socio-technical design, but also thinking about it as an outcome. And I think that's where a lot of the gains could be had, or the benefits can be demonstrated, that the outcome is a public interest technology that has some kind of value, some kind of utility. And that's something that I see as probably being beneficial from an industry perspective, more so than a research perspective. As I said earlier, these terms have been gaining traction. There's been this resurgence in terms of socio-technical theories and studies. The one area that I think it can be used as a shorthand, perhaps, is in terms of the high-level system representation. So often the elements of the socio-technical ecosystem around public interest technology are such that certain elements of that system resonate across disciplinary boundaries. So that's something where I think people can connect to that particular framework. So people working in moral philosophy and ethics will look at the human values. Technologists will appreciate the technological landscape. Those at the intersection of technology and society might look at the information systems-based components and the connection between co-design processes and that processing element. So from that perspective, I think there's an opportunity to connect to the framework.
Can we just get back to talking about universities for a moment? We touched on it before, but what's the most kind of instrumental approach universities can adopt to contribute in this space? Is it research centres? Is it curriculum? Is it all of the above? Because I think, everyone listening to this today will be aware of the problems of extreme siloing. But it seems to me that some of the themes we've discussed today, like finding common language, getting people to feel within an academic structure that they can be equal partners in developing programs or research projects. Are there structures that seem to work in facilitating this in the States or elsewhere that we could learn from in Australia, do you think?
Certainly, another fabulous question, again, with multiple elements to it. So we have spent quite some time as a team thinking about curriculum-based strategies and research-based strategies that might assist in promoting socio-technical and certainly multidisciplinary research. So if we look to examples, for instance, where my colleague Katina Michael lives in Arizona State University, they've formed structures around transdisciplinary schools, for example, and that's their way of encouraging this to be incorporated into the curriculum. In terms of what we can do in Australia or in the Australian context, I might share one or two examples. So you spoke about the curriculum itself, and then you said about research, and I see them as interconnected things, but also diverse things. But curriculum-wise, I think it would be helpful to, firstly, embed ethics, social and humanistic values in technical curricula beyond what's required for accreditation purposes, and to be quite proactive in this endeavor. I think that'll solve a lot of the issues that we have certainly at the moment, or the challenges that we're facing. And I have mentioned this next point in many presentations and forums, and we'll reiterate again, but based on my experience and those of colleagues in teaching in technical and engineering-based schools, often ethics, socio-technical and socio-ethical considerations are afterthoughts. And one way we can convert this in our curriculum or curriculum redesign is to consider them as precursors and not as an afterthought. And another related point is that we also need to demonstrate the value, as I said earlier, of these socio-technical and public interest technology approaches in practice. So it is quite I would say, a relatively new concept in Australia, if we can demonstrate some kind of value of their ability to, from a technical perspective, integrate in existing technical and other processes. So I think about, Laurie, in terms of my time in industry, there are set technical systems and other development processes in place, and we can't immediately eradicate those. There's no need to. I think we need to be respectful of that and see how best to, I guess, integrate ethics, humanistic values, socio-technical aspects within existing technical and other processes. As to the research side, I did touch slightly on some of these themes, but I believe that we can promote research cultures that are supportive of this type of research at numerous levels. And I'll draw on some examples of these levels that I'm certainly working on at the moment. The first is at the individual project level. So I think we have a responsibility in multi and interdisciplinary teams to have open and transparent communications between technical and non-technical project team members and multidisciplinary team members towards that common goal to then demonstrate value. Also at the institutional level, it's to facilitate some kind of multidisciplinary engagement through some grant-based and other schemes. And I mentioned earlier, the University of Wollongong has a Global Challenges program, which is perfect for this kind of endeavour. But then again, for research-wise, for large funding bodies, it's to find a way to demonstrate again that value of multi and socio-technical collaborations and projects, rather than trying to box us in or to make us adhere to, for instance, define 4 codes. But that's part of, I think, a much larger discussion or broader discussion.
Thanks for that, Rover. Sorry, I was just didn't realise I put my mute button on. It happens once in every session. Just a reminder, if you've got questions, just tap them into the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And Sam Wilson has also just asked a question about how pervasive the socio-technical approach is becoming within engineering and IS.
Oh, that's an excellent question, Sam. I will answer it again in talking to the information systems discipline first and then talking to engineering. The information systems discipline by nature is a socio-technical discipline. So if I revert to or refer back to that initial slide where I showed, is socio-technical a concept? Is it a theory? What is it? Within the information systems space, the foundation for information systems is that it is a socio-technical discipline. So it's always there as an underlying, I guess, foundation for everything we do in the discipline. However, given that we're speaking about socio-technical theory, the information systems discipline has had an interesting relationship with the theory. So we've gone through phases in which the theory was introduced in the 1950s. It took quite a while for it to gain traction. Towards the 80s, it was starting to become more prominent. In the 90s, you started to see more of those participatory approaches, certainly in the human-computer interaction field. And then we've sort of focused for recent years on technological progression. And now we seem to have gone to the other side of thinking about the dark side of tech, and socio-technical, Sam, sort of fits in between those two extremes of the dark side and the shiny gadgetry, technological potential. It's all about the tech perspective. We are seeing over, I would say, the past 3 or 4 years, if I was to define it by time, an increased interest in socio-technical. It's still too early to see whether it's about the theory itself, but it is in existence in a range of different realms, slightly a different flavour to what we're talking about here in terms of public interest technology. But for instance, the work of Stephen Alter in work systems frameworks, that's been around. That's quite a popular framework for how we think about work systems from a socio-technical perspective. You then have the design stream, which is by Mumford, and I alluded to one of those design processes on the screen, and that's been picked up on, but tends to attract a lot of criticism due to some of the challenges we spoke about today, relevant to operationalization, I guess, of socio-technical theories. So that's the information system space. It's always there in one form or another. Theory-wise, I think there's much more that can be done in terms of extending socio-technical theories from an information systems perspective, and that's something of particular interest. In terms of engineering, a little less so. So if I draw on, for instance, teaching in engineering school, socio-technical doesn't seem to feature as a specific theory within that realm. We do talk about ethics, so the ethical implications of specific engineering experiments or designs and so on, but it's not specifically a theory. As far as my understanding, that is taught, certainly not in my experience. Perhaps in some schools there is, but if there are such examples, it would be great to sort of hear more about how they're executing that, because I think we can learn a lot from that particular, I guess, if it's built into their curriculum.
Right. Thanks for that, Sam. Just a final question from me. We talked a bit about public interest tech as a concept and how COVID might have accelerated some of the discussions around how people see decision-making to be in the public interest with things like vaccinations. What about AI, and what about AI researchers who and AI companies, where very often now we're seeing criticisms about the kind of world that they're seen to be creating. What's been the extent to which you feel that the framework that you've discussed today is actually getting into the bloodstream of people who create the technologies and the companies that make a lot of money out of them?
That's a fabulous question. I can certainly talk to research in that space. So we've been engaging in our public interest technology colloquium recently, in which we held 2 sessions specifically about artificial intelligence and the public interest, as a way of mapping some of the opportunities, some of the challenges. I'll be happy to share some of those, but some of the outcomes there is, I guess, aligned to the discussions that we're having here today, Laurie. I'm not sure whether the technologists or the companies themselves are approaching this from a socio-technical perspective. There's certainly traction in principles-based approaches, so responsible artificial intelligence and how we translate principles to practice, how we think about governance of AI, for example. We're working in the context of the development of care platforms around AI. We've also spoken about AI in terms of responsibility of designers and other stakeholders, and I'll be happy to share some of the published work on that. I think there's a long way to go. Again, back to that, how far down the track we are here. We are at least having discussions about principles and translating them to practice, and that is not unrelated to some of these. I think what we're missing is a broader framework to encompass all of these discussions and to translate them in a meaningful fashion across disciplines, across sectors, thinking about it from one academic institution to the other, from one industry to the other. And again, back to that point of a common set of understandings or a language that allows us to communicate properly, and as Sam put in the chat, to not talk past each other, to have that common understanding to allow us to actually progress these kind of discussions. But I'm happy to share any of the AI related links if you're interested in that. It was part of a 2-part discussion. Yeah, not a problem.
Yeah, we'd really appreciate that. Okay, one final question from Matt. What role does future casting, backcasting and speculative design play in these approaches? And it might be worth just shedding light on how these terms have come into the vocabulary around socio-technical design as well.
Sure. So I might draw on an example of some socio-technical studies that we've done in the past. So we can draw on historical, implementations. We can look to the past to allow us to think about how we inform our decisions around the future and how we think about them, these decisions and conceptualize them from a socio-technical perspective. We can also look at speculative fiction, for example. So I alluded to that in my introduction, but due to the time, I couldn't sort of go into that in too much detail, where I spoke about sort of the techno-optimistic view, and the intention of those initial images was to evoke, I guess, a sense around technological potential advancement and progression. And then the last image I showed before returning to my initial one was about this dystopian view. And when we think about speculative fiction, for example, these types of approaches, in addition to the others that you mentioned, Matt and Laurie, allow us to think about a range of different scenarios and then develop a sense of how we might design to those scenarios or mitigate risks around those scenarios. So some of the work that we're involved in additionally is about risk management, for example, how we design complex anti-fragile systems or systems that respond well to, I guess, threats, or use tone of vulnerability into gain rather than sort of breaking when something occurs. And that's part of this discussion as well. So how do we think about these risky situations? These particular approaches that Matt spoke about, I think, have a very important part to play, so we can learn historically from some of our mistakes. And something that talks to that point, Matt, is when we think about information systems failures in general, I think in excess, if I'm not mistaken, someone can correct me here, in excess of 70% of information systems projects fail. I'll have to sort of confirm that figure, but the last time I checked, it was in excess of 70%. And the reason is that we repeat the same mistakes. And I think through some of these approaches, we can look to the past to inform the future, and then use speculative fiction to map out the range of different scenarios that might eventuate, and then preemptively look at addressing them through some of these frameworks and some of these approaches. Again, approaches that need to be participatory in nature, that need to engage individuals, empower individuals, so we can leverage off those really good cases or those use cases that we perceive to be positive, whilst also mitigating risks around the undesirable consequences of those scenarios that are less so. Great question, Matt.
And thanks, Rob. I feel like this discussion's just really warming up now. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but thank you so much. Fascinating presentation. Great, really inspiring in terms of looking at our environments in our own universities and our relationships with industry to think about what's possible through this framework and through this discussion. So thank you so much, Robert. And I'm going to hand you back now to Diane.
Thank you, Laurie. And I'm just going to wrap up with just a quick thank you to everyone here. So first of all, a huge thank you to Dr. Roba Abbas. It's been really exciting today to hear about a framework that helps us to more properly think through the design and the development and the implementation of public interest technology. It's a framework that allows us to advance technology in a way that is human-centric and that really emphasizes values in the development of technology. I love the idea of this socio-technical ecosystem where the social and technical and environmental components are working together for system success. To our audience, thank you very much for taking the time to be here. I have no doubt there will be many continued conversations after today's webinar. There's a real growing interest in Australia in public interest technology, but there aren't that many opportunities for academics interested in this to really learn about these practical, rigorous standards and frameworks for designing public interest technology. So we hope you've come away from this webinar today with a bit of a clearer understanding of the public interest technology research agenda and a useful framework for the development of public interest technology. And I'd invite you to visit the website of the Public Interest Technology Program and the Social Innovation Research Institute. We'd invite you to register your interest in the Technology by Society Forum. We'll be holding more events throughout the year, and we'd love you to join us to further some of these discussions. So whether or not you register with us, please do keep an eye out for our events, which we'll be holding throughout the year, and we'll advertise those events through Swinburne and La Trobe. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to hand back over to Paul to close us out.
Great. Thanks, Diane. So basically what Diane said. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Stay tuned. Thanks. Bye.